faithful to God, refuses to worship the emperor's false gods and unjust ways, and practices steadfast nonviolence. And this marvelous story begins with divine approval of vegetarianism. The book of the prophet Isaiah proclaims the vision of the peaceable kingdom, that new realm of God where everyone will beat their swords into plowshares, refuse to study war, enjoy their own vine and fig tree, and never fear again. Several passages condemn meat eating and foresee a day when people and animals will adopt a vegetarian diet, when, quote, "the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid. They do no violence, no harm on all my holy mountain," unquote. Of course, God's covenant is always with all flesh, animal and human, and in the conclusion to Isaiah, God speaks of those who kill animals in the same way as those who murder people, and heralds instead the dawn of a new day of peace. According to the prophet Hosea, God says, "I will make a covenant on behalf of Israel with the wild beasts, the birds of the air, and the things that creep on the earth, and I will break every bow and sword and weapon of war, and sweep them off the earth, so that all living creatures may lie down without living in fear." All these beautiful visions of the prophets reach their fulfillment, according to Christianity, in the life of Jesus. Jesus is the new Adam, who returns to us the totally nonviolent Garden of Eden. He is the Prince of Peace, who ushers in God's vision of nonviolence, mercy, and justice. Jesus spent his life healing the broken, liberating the oppressed, calling for justice, practicing nonviolence, and confronting the structures of oppression by turning over the tables of injustice. By the time he was 33, the ruling authorities had had enough and executed him. As I consider what it means to be a Christian today, reflecting on the radical nonviolent life of Jesus, I believe that today Jesus sides with the starving, the homeless, the refugees, and the children of the world who continue to be crushed by first world greed and war-making. If Jesus lived in our culture of violence, he would do everything he could to confront the structures of death and call for a new culture of peace and life. He would want us to change every aspect of our lives, to seek complete physical, spiritual, emotional, and ethical wholeness, to become people of nonviolence, children of the God of peace. Anglican priest, theologian, and Oxford professor, the Reverend Dr. Andrew Lindsay, suggests that following Christ means casting our lot with the most oppressed. In his book, Animal Theology, he says that today, no beings are more oppressed than the animals who are treated so badly by the meat industry. I conclude that as Christians, we must side with the poor and oppressed peoples of the world and with animals. In fact, the Gospels are full of favorable references to animals and reveal that Jesus had a great reverence for animals and nature. As Louis Regenstein points out in his book, Replenish the Earth, A History of Organized Religion's Treatment of Animals and Nature, Jesus calls his followers sheep. He compares his care for Jerusalem with a hen's care for her brood. He likens himself to animals, such as a lamb and a dove, because of their innocence and meekness. "Behold the birds of the air," Jesus says. "They do not sow, they do not reap, nor do they gather into barns, yet your heavenly God feeds them. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies?" Jesus later asks, "and yet not one of them is forgotten by God." Indeed, in John's Gospel, Jesus describes himself as a good shepherd and notes that a good shepherd lays down his life for his flock of sheep. Dare we conclude that Jesus approves the ultimate act of compassion and love, to die nonviolently, even to protect animals? Jesus embodied nonviolence and compassion. The rest of us are called to follow in his gentle footsteps, yet few have approached him. I think of St. Francis of Assisi, who walked among the poor, preached peace, and in particular loved and celebrated all of creation, including animals. "Not to hurt our humble brethren the animals," he said, "is our first duty to them. But to stop there is not enough. We have a higher mission, to be of service to them whenever they require it. If you have people who will exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity," he said, "you will have people who will deal likewise with other people." Reverend Dr. Lindsay suggests, like St. Francis, that human beings should not act as the master species, but as the servant species. Christ came as a humble servant and called us to love and serve one another and not to harm anyone. Lindsay suggests that the gospel call to service includes not only selfless service and justice to the poor and oppressed, but also to all creation, including animals. In this way, we become more Christ-like. Many early Christians advocated vegetarianism, including Tertullian, the great advocate of nonviolence, St. John Chrysostom, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and St. Jerome, a doctor of the Church and an early translator of the Bible. The theologian Clement of Alexandria urged Christians to become vegetarians, saying, "It is far better to be happy than to have your bodies act as graveyards for animals." It is clear that for the first 3 centuries after Christ, a Christian could not kill or participate in war. Christians were nonviolent. Some scholars argue that most early Christians were also vegetarians, and that meat eating was not officially allowed until the 4th century, when the Church embraced Constantine and the Roman Empire. Then, just as Christians rejected Jesus' nonviolence and devised the heresy of the so-called just war theory, they deliberately approved meat eating. Regardless of this past practice, though, the question we Christians have to ask ourselves is, how can we become more Christ-like and more faithful to the nonviolent Jesus? Where in our lives could we be more merciful, more compassionate? In our own times, Christians around the world are waking up to the gospel imperative to pursue peace and justice for all people, to reject war, and to practice the active nonviolence of Jesus. They are also rethinking our mistreatment of animals and creation. Many are becoming vegetarians. In 1966, the Vatican newspaper wrote for the first time, "To ill-treat animals and make them suffer without reason is an act of deplorable cruelty to be condemned from a Christian point of view." Other bishops began to include cruelty toward animals under the basic sin of violence. In December of 2000, the Vatican newspaper pointed out that the Catholic Catechism says that it is contrary to human dignity to cause animals to suffer or die needlessly. The article went on to question the way animals are raised and killed for food today. Theologian Thomas Berry sums up the growing trend among Christians as follows: "Vegetarianism is a way of life that we should all move toward for economic survival, physical well-being, and spiritual integrity." In other words, one more way we Christians can welcome Christ's reign of nonviolence is by becoming vegetarians. So when we sit down to eat, when we say our grace and evoke the blessing of Jesus, we should also choose to adhere to his life of compassion and nonviolence by maintaining a vegetarian diet. And we know that as we practice mercy to one another and to all God's creatures, we too shall receive mercy and blessings, as Jesus promised in the Beatitudes. Yet the reality today for God's creatures is neither compassionate nor merciful. Our treatment of God's animals is cruel and gruesome. Each year, the United States raises and kills about 9 billion land animals and slaughters another 15 billion sea animals. Laying hens, who are raised for their eggs, spend their entire lives crammed into small wire mesh cages not much larger than file drawers and stacked in warehouses with tens of thousands of other birds. Conditions are so horrendous that their feet often grow through and around the wire. 1/3 of the birds suffer broken legs on the packed and painful ride to the slaughterhouse, which often entails days without food and water through all weather extremes. One egg represents 34 hours of suffering for a hen, not to mention the ride to the slaughterhouse and slaughter itself. 250 million male birds are suffocated or ground to death. They are useless for the egg industry and are a different strain of bird from those useful for meat. Meanwhile, chickens, pigs, turkeys, dairy cows, and beef cows are genetically bred, fed drugs to make them grow faster, separated from their families at birth, and mutilated without any painkillers. Chickens have their beaks chopped off with a hot blade. Cows and pigs are castrated. Cows have their horns ripped out of the heads. Pigs have their teeth pulled out with pliers and their tails chopped off, and so on. They all suffer the mental and physical anguish of living in tiny spaces with no relief, no ability to act on any of their natural desires and needs, and no hope